Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to demystify a term you hear thrown around constantly, but maybe don't fully get: earnings per share, or EPS. We're going to break down exactly what it is, how it works, and why it's so incredibly important for understanding a company's financial health. So, let's kick things off with a little puzzle. A company announces they've made a whopping $100 million in profit. Now, on the surface, that sounds amazing, right? But here's the thing. What does that huge number actually mean for you, the person holding the stock? Well, it really all comes down to how that profit pie gets sliced. And as you can see right here, just looking at that big profit number can be super misleading. Company A has this massive profit, but it's split between a billion shares. Your personal slice, just 10 cents. Meanwhile, look at Company B, a much smaller profit, but because there are way fewer shares, your slice is $10. That's 100 times bigger. This is precisely why we need a better way to measure this. Okay, so let's get right into it. That better metric is, you guessed it, earnings per share. And this is, hands down, one of the most vital signs of a company's performance, especially from a shareholder's point of view. To put it simply, EPS answers the one question that really matters. For every single share you own, how much of the company's profit belongs to you? It just cuts right through all the noise of those giant headline-grabbing profit numbers and tells you what's what. And the basic math, it's beautifully simple. You just take the company's profit, you divide it by the number of shares out there in the world, and bam! You've got a number that directly connects the company's success to the value for each individual shareholder. Okay, let's look at this formula in action. If you check out the calculation for 20x7, the math is crystal clear. They took their earnings of $460,000, divided it by 800,000 shares, and that got them an EPS of 57.5 cents. Simple enough, right? Well, here's where things start to get a little more interesting. Because, the real world is messy. The number of shares a company has, it almost never stays the same for a whole year. And that, of course, complicates our nice, simple calculation. So that brings up a really important question, right? If a company pumps out a bunch of new shares in, say, July, should those new shares get a claim on the profits the company made way back in January? No way, that just wouldn't be fair. So how do we account for that and get a more accurate picture? The answer is a pretty clever little tool called the weighted average number of shares. See, instead of just grabbing the number of shares at the end of the year, we actually adjust the count based on when those new shares appeared. This makes sure that new shares only get credit for the profits earned during the time they were actually, in existence. And you can see exactly how this works right here. Check out the numbers for 20x8. The company started with 800,000 shares, then they issued another 200,000 on July 1st, right in the middle of the year. So instead of just adding them all up, those new shares are only counted for half the year. This gives us a much more fair and accurate number for our EPS calculation, a weighted average of 900,000 shares. Now, here's something crucial to remember. Not all new shares are created equal. Think of it like a pizza. A bonus issue is like the company decides to just cut the same pizza into more smaller slices. The total amount of pizza doesn't change. But a rights issue is different. That's when the company sells new shares to bring in fresh cash. That new money actually makes the whole pizza bigger for everyone. All right, so we've got the basics down. We know what's happening right now. But if you're a smart investor, you're not just looking at today. You're thinking about tomorrow. What if there are hidden risks that could shrink your slice of that pie? And you gotta remember, basic EPS is just that, a snapshot. It's a great look in the rearview mirror, telling you about past profitability based on the shares that exist right now. But it only tells you what did happen, not what could happen. Which leads to this huge, critical question. What happens if the company could just, poof, create a whole wave of new shares tomorrow? What would that do to your personal earnings per share? And this is where our second key metric comes in, diluted EPS. Honestly, the best way to think about this is as a financial stress test. It's a what-if calculation. It shows you what the EPS would look like in a worst-case scenario, if all those potential new shares suddenly became real. It's all about revealing the potential downside. So where does this potential flood of new shares come from? Well, a few common places. There are things like convertible bonds, that's debt that can be swapped for stock. There are employee stock options, the right for workers to buy shares at a set price later on. And there are warrants, which are kind of similar to options. All of these could create more shares down the road.
The source material we're looking at really hits the nail on the head here. It basically says that just looking at basic EPS can be dangerous. If there's a chance more shares could pop up in the future, that basic number isn't giving you the full story. It might even be giving you a false sense of security.
And wow, look at this example. Just check out the numbers for 20x2. The basic EPS looks pretty healthy at 16.3 cents. But when you run that what-if stress test for the convertible loans, the diluted EPS plummets to just 13 cents. That's a pretty significant potential hit to your earnings, and it's something every investor absolutely needs to know about.
All right, so now we've got both basic and diluted EPS in our toolkit. We get the difference. So the big question is, how do we actually use this stuff as investors?
Well, for starters, EPS isn't just a number you look at in isolation. It's actually a super important building block for other key metrics. And the most famous one of all, that's the PE ratio, or price to earnings.
The math is dead simple. You take the current stock price and you divide it by the earnings per share. But what it tells you is powerful. It gives you a quick sense of how much the market is willing to pay for every single dollar that company earns. And as you can see, without EPS, this whole calculation just isn't possible.
But, and this is a big but, you have to be smart about using EPS. It is not a magic wand. For one, it's always looking backward. It tells you about the past, not the future. It can also be nudged around by a company's accounting choices. So while it is an incredibly powerful tool, it is definitely not the only tool you should have in your box. And that really leaves us with one final big idea to chew on. EPS is fantastic for telling you how big your slice of the profit pie is. But figuring out what that slice, what the entire company, is truly worth, well, that, my friends, is where the real adventure of investing begins.